Well, good morning. Namaste. Very happy to be here with you. This is the first time in a few months where I've actually been in front of people. And I want to thank you all for coming out today. I have a radio program on WGVU, the local NPR affiliate on world religions and spirituality. And just a couple of weeks ago, I interviewed a gentleman. He is a very renowned religion journalist. He actually used to work for the Vatican. And he's now at Fordham University in New York. And he wrote an article entitled "The Coming Religious Recession," where he indicates his concerns, and he predicts that religious congregations are going to go through a significant paradigm shift because of COVID. And he says, a lot of people, quite frankly, are going to realize it's nice to sleep in on a Sunday morning. And we have become, in some sense, a nation of hermits. And this goes above and beyond COVID, right? Why go to a movie theater where you can just pull out your iPad and watch a full-length film? Why go to a restaurant when you can have it delivered, or go use the drive-thru? Sometimes we have to pull ourselves out of our nest. And he said that those congregations will thrive, the ones who truly value community. And so it is up to each and every congregation to make sure that that value of community is understood by everyone. So with that, again, I do hope that this congregation ultimately thrives in the aftermath of this pandemic, and that everyone will see the value of community. Today, for my message, I'd like to deconstruct, if you will, the daily word. I really enjoy doing that. You might know, those of you who've seen me before, that I tend to do that, not exclusively. Sometimes I have a message above and beyond the daily word, but I find so much wisdom in these pithy sayings, and sometimes just to hear them once in the service doesn't really allow us to mine the wisdom. Let's take a look at this first line. Like a bird flying skyward, I lift up on the wings of my heart to know my divinity. Think about that. How do we know our divinity? Is it something that we've logically come to the conclusion of? Is it something that has been intellectually attained? Is it something that has been experienced? On the wings of my heart, I know my divinity. And what do we think of when the heart comes to mind? And that is love. It is the power of love, what we call in the Hindu tradition Bhakti Yoga, right? There are several schools of yoga. And oftentimes when we think of yoga here in the West, we think simply of Hatha Yoga, the yoga that you go to a studio or to a gym to practice. And Hatha Yoga is really considered a minor subset of a greater yoga tradition. I've gone through that before. I won't go into detail right now. But the main yogas are that of bhakti, as I mentioned, which is devotion, which is love; jnana, which is wisdom; karma yoga, which is selfless service; and raja, which is meditation. And hatha yoga is considered a preparation in raja yoga for meditation, to keep the body limber and allow it to keep still. So let's talk about Bhakti Yoga, the yoga of the heart, the yoga of devotion. Science today tells us that the mind is not, even not just the mind, but the brain. The brain itself is not all encompassed in a skull. That the brain actually has elements of it throughout our body. Our intestines have a brain, and our heart has a brain. And we use these different elements of the brain throughout our body in different aspects of our lives. So that brain, if you will, that's in the heart has a very important job to do. Through Bhakti Yoga practices, we unleash that power, and we're able to see that love of divinity, if we allow it, will open up to us as experience. There are some people who are stuck in the intellectual. They're stuck in the brain, if you will. Everything has to be logical. Everything has to be rational. And there is a part for that on the spiritual path. Because people who become overwhelmed by love with no intellectual understanding, with no use of logic, if they become imbalanced in that particular way, you know what happens to them? They get stupid. They do. This is how people join cults. This is how people connect themselves to religious movements that are unhealthy, because that one part is activated without the other. So there needs to be a balance, right, of the so-called the head and the heart. So we need to keep a little part of that intellectual process, that logical process. We need to keep that alive in us. But when we love unconditionally, when we begin to see the divine as the object of our affection, then we can see our own divinity. Because we can't see our own divinity purely through logic, purely through the intellectual process. There's so much that we cannot see simply using the senses and using logic. It says here, my majestic spirit knows how to soar, and I easily take flight. As my spirit ascends, I feel light and free. The bright, radiant freedom of my soul shines like the sun on my wings. And it is love that sparked that soaring. It says, in this peaceful time, I open to my spiritual awareness, arise and rise into that part of me that can hold a higher perspective. See, as I mentioned just a minute ago, only using logic, only using our mental faculties, we cannot know God. We have to use that intuition that is foundationally built on love. There is an account. I'll give you a couple of true accounts. There was one great Hindu saint, Rajarsi Janakananda. And this just happened, this isn't the story from 2,000 years ago, this happened in the last century. And he was with some students, some other monks, and probably nuns as well. And someone asked him a deeply profound question about God, about the existence of God, or God connecting through us, to us, whatever. And he said, that's interesting, I don't know. So he secluded himself for a couple of hours, went into deep meditation, and he came out and once again addressed the group and said, I'm so glad that you asked me that question, and I now have the answer. And I invite you to go into deep meditation so that you may find the answer as well. Because he couldn't relate that answer. It is said in the Buddhist tradition, the truth repeated is a lie. Because if you were to go up to somebody who never knew what it was like, say, to be in love, or even to be infatuated with somebody, and they had no clue, how could you explain that to them? How could you explain what being in love? You could only go so far, and it's like you gotta do it yourself. There's another story of a great Hindu saint, Ramakrishna, in the 19th century. And Ramakrishna had attained a very, very high spiritual state. And he was known to be able to go into a deep meditation and actually know, not just believe, but know that divinity, his divinity, as it says here, I lift on the wings of my heart to know my divinity. He was able to do that. He was also a priest, and he knew all of the rituals, and he knew the devotional songs to sing, and all of the various practices. And in Hinduism, it is stated that sometimes you go in stages like you need to do this, and you don't need to do that anymore. Okay, so for instance, in the military, you go through boot camp. It's a very important part of military life. You go through boot camp, but you don't stay in boot camp. If you stayed in boot camp, you wouldn't grow into anything else. So there are certain things you do at this stage, and then this stage, and this stage. And people thought, boy, going through the rituals and the devotional practices, why would you bother to do that, Ramakrishna? You've attained what you need to attain. You know your own divinity. And Ramakrishna had a specific devotion to the divine in the form of the mother. He would always talk about his divine mother and how he was her naughty baby. That's how he expressed his devotion. And in response to saying, well, why are you still doing this when you already have this? And he said, sometimes I like to taste the sugar, and sometimes I like to be the sugar. He was able to move effortlessly through all of those stages. There's another story along these same lines. It also involves a priest. So there was this rickshaw driver. The other two stories I told you were true. I doubt that this one is literally true, historically true. But there was this rickshaw driver in India, and he was a very devotional man. He would love to go to the temple, particularly on Friday nights, and take part in a puja. A puja would be a ceremony. He loved that. Well, it was getting towards Friday evening, and he was so excited that he wanted to go to the temple, that if he only had to work another few minutes. And all of a sudden, this very large man approaches him and says, take me to this address on the other side of town. Well, the poor rickshaw driver, he had to hoist him up on his rickshaw and go as fast as he could to the other side of town. And finally, he drops him off, and he races from that point to the temple. And as he approaches the temple, he sees the priest walking out. And the driver says to the priest, did I miss the puja? And the priest says, yes, you did. I just finished. And the driver just sighed. Oh. Now the priest was very learned. He knew the scriptures. He knew the ceremonies. But his heart was dry. But he thought for a second. And he said, "You know something, Mr. Driver? I'll make you a deal. I will trade you the punya. Punya is spiritual merit. I will trade you the punya that I received for performing the puja, for that sai of yours." The driver goes, "Are you kidding me? To be able to have the punya, to be able to have the spiritual merit of a priest who just did no contest. Where do I sign?" And the priest says, "Very well." So the priest recites this mantra, and he says, "It is done. You have all of my punya, and I have this little sigh that you uttered." Well, the rickshaw driver races home. And later on, he goes to bed. And when he's asleep, in a dream, he sees Lord Shiva come to him and saying, "You fool, do you realize that that sigh, the devotion that was contained in that one sigh, is taking that priest over the river of delusion to full enlightenment? And you are stuck with the mere blessings of a ritual?" And the rickshaw driver was saddened, for he realized what he had given away. So again, that it's that devotion that allows us to fly skyward, as it says. I am spiritually supported as I glimpse new energy and life at my soul's new elevation. We have to feel our spiritual progress. Last time I was here, I talked about spiritual progress. And one of the signs of spiritual progress is that you actually see it. And other people should see it as well. I breathe freely as I playfully soar above the day-to-day drama of life. That's another very strong Hindu concept, to be able to move freely and playfully throughout this life. Now, of course, there's so much that we can't just giggle our way through lives. Life can be challenging, life can be hard. But it's wonderful when you have a portion of yourself that's above the challenge and looking down and seeing this as God's lila, God's play. I move into the clear, limitless atmosphere of truth where I can fully express God's inspiration and joy. And I want to close by comparing two scriptural verses. The verse today, which comes from the 23rd chapter of Proverbs, says, "My child, give me your heart and let your eyes observe my ways." Give me your heart. And this is from the final chapter of the Bhagavad Gita. Lord Krishna, who symbolizes God, is speaking to his disciple, Arjuna, who represents all of us. And after a long discourse on everything, 18 chapters of wisdom, the final words of Krishna are, "Nay, but once more take my last word, my utmost meaning have. Precious thou art to me, right well beloved. Listen, I tell thee for thy comfort this, give me thy heart. Adore me, serve me, cling in faith and love and reverence to me. So shalt thou come to me. I promise true, for thou art sweet to me. And let go those rights and writ duties." Essentially what he's saying there, as I mentioned in the last story, those ceremonies are fine at a certain level. Writ duties mean Scripture. Scripture is fine, but you're surpassing that. You don't need Scripture anymore. You have me. and let go rights and duties. Fly to me alone. Make me thy single refuge. I will free thy soul from all its sins. And this very last sentence, be of good cheer. So I invite all of you, and I say the same thing to myself because I need it probably more than you. Be of good cheer and open thy heart to all humanity and to that divinity beyond humanity. Namaste.